I really like buttons. I always have. When I was a kid, my family would find me pushing buttons I wasn't supposed to, and then suggest they get me a button board with all sorts of different types of buttons to fiddle with.
That sounds great. I'm still waiting for it.
It is why I absolutely hate flat design. It's basically the way your computer and websites have been looking for almost a whole decade and a half now.
Things didn't always look like this, and let me tell you, the way it came to be is even worse. And now, despite Apple claiming to have completely redesigned all their operating systems, things aren't actually clear.
The stage is set for something new. Let's take a look.
When Apple announced their all-new liquid glass redesign at WWDC last June, I was struck by how their VP of Software Design, Alan Dye, introduced it.
Software is the heart and soul of our products. It brings them to life, shapes their personality, and defines their purpose.
This is correct, sure, but that is the most banal teacher's pet copy one could write about Apple software. And of course, the flat design, what life and personality are we talking about specifically? It appears that liquid glass might be bringing some personality to life, and I should be excited for it, because just look.
System buttons within the updated operating systems warp and refract the content behind them. It's a neat effect, and tapping and moving these buttons make them bounce and bloop in a satisfyingly fluid way.
But I'm actually not happy, because liquid glass is a dumb user interface design idea dropped on top of the existing flat design paradigm, and it fundamentally doesn't make any sense. The first example appears right when you boot up the phone.
Sliding up the lock screen, the bottom edge of, the glass appears to get thicker, refracting the wallpaper underneath at its edge. Then, once it's out of the way, there's a quick transition to the home screen and its wallpaper.
What metaphor am I interacting with here? It's impossible to describe because it's impossible to imagine.
The liquid glass refraction effect itself is neat to see. It reveals a volume to things that haven't had any for a while.
The design goal they constantly articulated was to make sure that the interface doesn't get in the way of the content. But that's the weird thing about liquid glass, is that it needs content behind it moving to be visible.
The more complex said content, the more noticeable the effect. And the more noticeable the effect, the less legible the other content set in liquid glass is. To address this, tab bars and controls shift from black to white, depending on what's scrolling underneath to maintain contrast. And there's a blur and fade applied to the edge to help those controls stand out.
It's just so messy, and worse still, a colossal waste of space. While I guess I'm technically seeing more of my content, the usable area of said content is shrunk, because there's stuff on top of it.
Putting Safari tabs in this pill shape means there now needs to be extra pixels of buffer for it to look decent, robbing space for content.
The price of the buttons I so desperately wanted was toolbars, it seems. Where am I supposed to click to move the window?
It's actually remarkable how most of what ends up getting refracted is text. So what was once contained by said toolbar is a visual mess. And when you don't have any content for liquid glass to render, the buttons, especially in light mode, are so lightly delineated it feels like the designers took the brightness setting you get at the start of a video game as inspiration.
Perfect.
There's just so many details that have gone awry. Like the sidebar now being the topmost visual thing within Windows. It's a sidebar. If you have an older phone, the specular highlight that outlines objects on the home screen reflects at odd and inconsistent angles, and on newer phones it moves around as you hold the phone, but not in a way that makes sense. Then there's the clear icons, which remind me of SNL's Crystal Gravy. On the Mac and even the iPad, the extra wide corner radius on Windows makes no sense, and makes the OS feel unserious. Oh, and every single icon Apple designed is worse and ugly.
Flat design hasn't actually gone anywhere. Software designers are still somehow afraid of drop shadows, distinctness, delineation, things that make a computer easier to use and easier to see. These are problems I thought we solved years ago, only to have it abandoned with flat design. It's still something I'm salty about, especially because I know what happened.
Up until 2013, Apple's software looked like this. Contrast and textures were abundant. Text fields had drop shadows in them to look like something you would type into, and buttons were rendered to appear like they were suddenly coming out of the screen with defined touch areas.
The name for this style is colloquially called skeuomorphism, which is a horrible name for a design concept where one keeps certain attributes even when they're technically not necessary anymore, like the tiny handle on a maple syrup bottle. I, however, think the term was used to discredit how Apple's software looked up until that point.
If you look at the designs we did at Apple, we talked about photo-illustrative designs. We talked about metaphorical designs. And those were infused into the design sense of Apple by Steve Jobs since the original Mac, if not earlier. Yep. The original Mac had a desktop and folders that looked very much like the desktop on which that Mac sat. Yeah. And so we used these design philosophies. It doesn't mean that we loved every single part of it. It doesn't mean I loved every single part of it. There's definitely things that I was less a fan of than others. But we built these designs that worked. And how do we know they worked? I mean, you just had to watch people use it.
Johnny Ive, and I'm sure plenty other executives within Apple, hated it. They didn't like how it didn't match the minimalist aesthetic of Apple's hardware.
And after Scott Forstall was ousted for not apologizing for Apple Maps, Johnny Ive, a hardware designer, was put in charge of software design. And boy, did he change things.
Flat design, I should note, was not an Apple invention, though they do have their own lame take on it. The actual start was with Microsoft, who introduced it with the Zune and then brought it to the mainstream with Windows Phone 7.
I remember catching a demonstration video for it on YouTube at the time and being in complete disbelief that that was Microsoft. Apple never copied Microsoft. In fact, they used to make fun of Microsoft for copying them. And yet, I'm sure Johnny, looking at those tiles and those giant thin type-faced headings that fit beyond the screen, was really jealous.
We tried to eliminate as much Chrome as we possibly can.
And so he did something about it.
I think there is a profound and enduring beauty in simplicity, in clarity, in efficiency. True simplicity is derived from so much more than just the absence of clutter and ornamentation. It's about bringing order to complexity.
Order? Order? The implication here is that the previous way Apple designed software was complex. And I mean, sure, I guess you could say it was visually complex. That is a relative term, especially compared to the way software looks today. But visual complexity does not mean functional complexity. In fact, I think that some visual complexity is absolutely necessary to the functionality of software.
In an interview with USA Today at the time, software VP Craig Federici used the new high-resolution display to justify the change, saying, "Before, the shadowing effect we used was a great way to distract from the limitations of the display." In that same piece, Johnny Ive justified removing buttons by saying, "We understood that people had already become comfortable with touching glass. They didn't need physical buttons, they understood the benefits."
This is a thoroughly rotten thought pattern, because what about when you need to introduce a new function to users? 3D Touch, anyone?
3D Touch is an interesting case in point. Here was a new layer of interaction added to the touchscreen: depth sensing. Apple released peek and pop functions, as well as a way to move the typing indicator and bring up pop-up dialog.
The thing is, there was no way visually to know that the function ever existed. You cannot portray a function of depth when your design theory is ultimately flat.
And Game Center, we just completely ran out of green felt.
In retrospect, WWDC 2013 was kind of mean. The whole thing was just littered with snarky jokes directed at the previous visual style their founder respected. This wasn't a revolution, it was a coup.
Contemporary reviews of iOS 7 weren't exactly nice to the visual style. Easy to look at textured backgrounds turned eye-searingly white. And buttons? Gone completely. And even just like today, icon design regressed significantly. Johnny Ive's grid system might be mathematically correct, but it is aesthetically unbalanced. Hey, at least they weren't a super ellipse.
God, I have to admit, I've grown a little cold on Johnny Ive. He's designed some great hardware in his time, but he clearly never respected why Apple software looked the way it did. And to be honest, his engagement waned and he left the design chops to Alan Dye, who gave us Liquid Glass. So, Alan Dye introduced Liquid Glass like a teacher's pet, Johnny iOS 7 like a fascist, but what about Steve Jobs when he introduced Aqua to OS X at the turn of the millennium?
You know, when you design a new user interface, you have to start off humbly. You have to start off saying, what are the simplest elements in it? What does a button look like?
That is a good question. What does a button look like?
Aqua wasn't perfect, and it evolved away from transparent menus and towards the iPhone. A lot of the discipline from that time did inform the way Apple approached software design for the revolutionary mobile devices we use today.
And that was the goal of this user interface, to make it span the range so that our people turning on their iMac for the first time were enchanted with it and was super easy to use. And yet our pro customers also felt, my God, this takes me to places I thought I could never get to.
What's interesting is that there's actually a freedom of expression to Steve's goal that Alan's empty personality and Johnny's order have never allowed for.
What could we have missed out on if we weren't afraid to mimic the magic of the real physical world within our software?
7 years ago, former Apple engineer Bob Burrow posted a video of his software design concept that used the front camera to render a reflection of the light in your physical environment off the software's interface.
I love it. It's legit magic because it brings software to life in the real world we live in.
Apple's current designers may have spent lots of time replicating the way round glass refracts light, but it's only responsive to what's underneath.
This story isn't over, and it gets kind of weird. In November 2025, barely months into the implementation of Liquid Glass, Alan Dye quit Apple to take a job at Meta, a company everyone hates.
In May 2025, Johnny Ive announced that he was joining with OpenAI to design, something significant.
So, if you need an indictment of these guys' tastes, there you go. But there is hope I never would have imagined.
Apple has replaced Alan Dye with Stephen LeMay, a well-regarded software designer who's worked at Apple since 1999.
The prognosis is good, and maybe Apple just might be able to rejuvenate its software like it did hardware with Apple Silicon. Oh, finally feels good to get that off my chest. Now, get subscribed because we will be thinking different about tech on this channel, starting off with me trying to fix calendars ruining my social life.